Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the React Europe Hangout. Today we have Conor Hastings, who is going to talk to us about um, states and effects. And how are you doing, Conor?
Well, good. Good. How are you?
Fine. Okay, so I will let you start, and if you have any question at the end, feel free to ask in the YouTube chat. Thanks.
Okay. Yep. So I'm just going to run through some basic little notes I wrote down first. So React has for a long time been talked about as a function of state or a function of props. You'll see this across blog posts going back as far as 2015, 2016. But it really neglects the fact that that state has to come from somewhere for most apps, and usually that's a network request to an API. And this is asynchronous. In the old React model, we do this in component did mount, or component will receive props, something like that. And hooks have kind of made this a little more confusing. We keep getting told to wait for suspense, and that will make everything easier. But for now, we're just seeing components littered with useEffect, since useReducer doesn't have everything that, say, Redux does with middleware and func, where you could fire those async actions. And so, yeah, so I would argue that it's actually a function of state and effects. And I think that's something that Reason ML saw pretty quickly. useReducer is synchronous, and you end up with just all these unwieldy use effects littering your code to trigger the network requests or trigger reaction to state updates, essentially changing the color or something. And we have this desire to co-locate these things because they go together. If I want to fetch data, let's say I wanted to send a fetch for data. While that data is fetching, I want to show some kind of loading spinner. And then when that data comes back, I want to set the state of that data and show, say, a list. We want these things to kind of belong together and not as like a dispatch and then a use effect that aren't necessarily connected. So has someone already come up with the right model is a question that I ask myself. And if you would go back to before Reason kind of had migrated to hooks, they had the concept of a reducer component, which allowed dispatching not only state updates, but side effects. So you would in your reducer say update with side effect, loading true, and then there'd be a callback where you get the data, you'd have that data and you'd set that data and you'd just run a synchronous update, and that would all live together. So it was basically essentially this was the API. So you were forced to use one of these four functions in your return in your reducer. So you'd have an update, which is just synchronous update with side effect, where side effect is a callback, just running a side effect, which is I want to do something, but I don't want to update the state first. I don't want to show that loading spinner. This is going to be quick enough. I don't need to do anything. Or maybe there's conditional in that reducer that produces no update. It's going to keep the same state. So trigger the action from the reducer. Reducer is supposed to be pure, right? So we can maintain the purity of the reducer essentially by queuing these side effects callbacks into a single array, and then in the hook world running one use effect after running through the reducer. That will then go through the side effects and they'll have access to the now current state. And so the reducer maintains pure and testable. while we still get the benefit of co-location. And I'll show an example in just a minute that should make this all much clearer. So if you look here, make it a little bigger. Instead of using useReducer, I'm using useReducer with side effects, but maintaining the API you would see if you were just using useReducer. I'm breaking down this array into state and dispatch. I'm passing a reducer, and I'm passing in an initial state value of just the number 1. And then I have a few buttons, which see over here. Add 5, and then subtract 2 after 3 seconds. So take the value of the state, add 5, then after 3 seconds, subtract 2. And now this is where it becomes asynchronous, right? So with the traditional useReducer, this would have to take place in an effect where you would set a timeout in the effect, and then after 3 seconds, you would send another dispatch that would subtract the 2. Here, we can do it all in a single add and subtract 2 action. And then multiply after 5 seconds. On the button, you can see it's actually multiply once after 5 seconds, since in that callback, you can keep track of the timeouts and clear previous timeouts, right? So if I smash this button, I really only want it to multiply once. And 5 seconds is a long time, but you'll see we can continue to watch that. It won't update. And then just a button that does nothing. It does no update. So I'm going to go up now to the reducer and just essentially show you how, one, just how I'm importing this, and two, how it might differ than the reducer you're used to. So I'm importing, I've stuck with this update, no update, update with side effect and side effect concept from Reason, because I think declaring exactly your intent just makes a lot of sense to me. You don't really actually have to do this. Just returning an object will be the same as returning an update. When you get into side effects, that's kind of when you kind of have to start using this, but you can imagine a world where we could very easily alter this library and not require these things. So in add and subtract 2, I'm simply running an update with a side effect where I send an increment added to the state, and the callback where I have this underscore, that would be get state and dispatch. So I get access to dispatch again. And as you can see here, I actually don't dispatch with the update. I just dispatch a plain object and tell it to decrement by 2. So, but in a set timeout, so after 3 seconds to decrement by 2. So now I have this all together as one thing, because to me in this app, they're just one action. They're actions that will always go together. And then if you see here, I have multiply after 5 seconds, where I am tracking the timeout IDs. And I'm just running a side effect here because I don't care about anything to do with the initial state. I'm setting a timeout with timeout ID. And then essentially in my return function, I will clear the timeouts, set timeout IDs to an empty array. And then if it gets down here, it will do state times 5. And then init action. Init is a third option. It's actually not shown here, but it is just like useReducer. You can start off the reducer with an action. And then otherwise, just do no update, just like you would just return the plain state in a reducer. you can return no update, or you can return the state. So yeah, so if we want to jump over and look at the code for a second, it's very much basic. So for no update, it's using a symbol just so that thing is unique. Update is literally state. Update with side effects is state side effects. Side effects is just side effects. So what first happens is we have this default export where we essentially write our own reducer on top of the reducer that's passed in, where we add this side effects key. And that is completely divorced from anything the user will see. So it's not something you would ever even have to worry about. So if it's a function, we just say the new state is that function. Otherwise, we do this where we're merging the state and the new state. And then we have these cancel functions. I just call them cancel functions here. And yeah, so then we can run through the side effects at the end of it all. So the reducer is still pure. We run through the reducer, and then we return state and side effects. And to the app, we just will return state. So if you go back up, you see how we execute the side effects. If we have side effects, we shift them off and just run through them and resolve them. And then return the state and the new side effects. And final reducer would be that's what's actually going to decide everything to do. Yeah, so I'm sorry. There's not too much more. It's pretty basic. It's just building upon prior art from Reason and Redux, where we don't want to really see our code littered with, every time we dispatch any action that would be asynchronous, we really don't want to see, this is not actually correct code, but we don't want to see that every time, right? Because once you get to like 4 or 5 of those and they're non-trivial, they're not just subtractions, then you start breaking apart components, you start writing your own custom hooks. And instead we could kind of just condense it into a single library in which we get pretty much everything we want. We get the reducer paradigm, but we also get these side effects, and we don't really have to think about them, and we can still test our reducer as a pure reducer. Yeah, so
Okay, that's cool. So it's kind of like reason pattern matching.
yeah. So the initial inspiration comes from the unfortunately now deprecated and not really replaced with hooks in Reason. Is Reason you had to either declare your component as a functional component or a reducer component. So basically in Reason you had to tell it not just that, like, you couldn't just have a component, like you'd be saying like this is a non-stateful or a stateful component.
Mm-hmm.
And this is basically that is like the main prior art for this is essentially declaring the stateful component, and by declaring a stateful component, it gave you these helpers to let you run side effects. But in app, this just looks like a same as a regular dispatch.
Okay, did you get to use it in production already?
Yeah, so I've used it in production on a couple small internal apps, and I know there's a couple things I can't mention because of
Yeah.
NDA, but I know it's being used in production at other places as well.
Okay, nice. And what do you think about Xstate? Do you have an opinion on?
Oh, Xstate, I'm a big fan. So I do use Xstate for state charting right now, and I do think kind of that is the future. I think this is kind of a middle step for me almost. Like I wasn't as familiar with Xstate then, and there's that book from like 1991. I forget what it's called, like building UIs with state charts that everyone is kind of obsessed with. And I just recently got a copy. I'm excited to go through it, and it's nice and refreshing to see a programming book from 1991 that's so relevant and not just about a language.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think like state, like diagramming all possible states is going to just lead to the least bugs. You could theoretically still use something like this to implement if you're just using a state chart, using it for state charting, which is what I've done. Yeah. So, but I think diagramming all possible states with your application makes sense because one, it makes testing easier, and it just means you're going to fill the gaps that you might not have filled. You're going to have probably the error screen that you wouldn't have had. You're going to have that loading screen you wouldn't have had.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you run into any gotchas in production? Are there any improvement you would like to add to your library to use?
Yeah. So I think I have an open GitHub issue for this. I just haven't gotten to yet. I think what we've really lost out on with useReducer, I think people are kind of moving towards souring on global state. I know not everyone is, but I think people are realizing there's a time for global state and a time for not global state, and I think the Redux hype kind of led to everyone putting everything in global state, me included. Yeah. I mean, I think I have a talk from React Europe 2016 in which it needs everything to be in global state. So, but what we've lost out on is Redux has this rich middleware system with tons of that just side effects, right? So I'd love to add a middleware system, and looking into the possibility with a friend of supporting at least some Redux middlewares. So you kind of we don't just lose a bunch of really good code that had a ton of functionality. Then moving to useReducer from Redux.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks, Connor. That was very, very interesting. Do you have anything else you would like to add, or it looks like we don't have any questions right now?
No, nothing else to add. I'm still Conor, CONOR on Twitter, so you can feel free to hit me up with any questions there. I'm happy to, or in the GitHub issues, I'm happy to. The library is called useReducer with side effects, all dashes between the words. I could just type it out.
Okay, we'll post a link on Twitter.
Yeah. Okay.
But you can type it out. Yes.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. And yeah, if you have anything to add or any issues or things you don't see, yeah, totally open to all ideas.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Connor. Cheers.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.